I'm wearing sunglasses because I have a black eye, and the way I got it was very boring, but just to have a good story, I got into a bar fight with an accelerationist. And I'm, uh, I guess in a way that's almost a summary of my talk, but let me give this a try. So I am an empiricist. I believe when you engineer something, you should test whether it's working. Like, for instance, if you send out a software update, you should check if it works before you send it out. We had a recent incident where somebody failed to do that, and it shut down a large part of the world. So I think we all agree on that here, right? Okay, so a question is, what do we need to test when it comes to Web3, when it comes to the internet in general, when it comes to computation in general? What exactly are we testing for? Well, one thing we could test for is just whether our software will work at all or whether it will brick a bunch of computers. That's important. And strangely, even that very simple thing doesn't seem to be done enough. Rather amazing to me at this late date. But I don't think that's all we need to test for. In my view, something remarkable has happened during my career in which we, the computer elite, if you like, have transformed the world. We've transformed the world in a new way, in a way that's really different from what had been done before. We have given the world almost like a video game to play, a world of information in which the world, everyone out there, finds their relationships, finds their meaning, finds their way in the world. And when we make that architecture, we design other people's lives. That's what we have done. Now, I have been part of this for a long time. I'm best known for starting virtual reality, but I've done some other things that I want to let you know about. I've worked in science fiction a lot. I was a consultant to Star Trek back in the 90s, but the main thing is I designed the gadget scenarios for the movie Minority Report in the 90s. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that my job then was to imagine what dystopian information technologies might be like in the future. Later on, something very strange started to happen, which is I would be in meetings in Silicon Valley somewhere, and people would say, "Oh, this gadget we want to make is so fantastic. It's like it's from Minority Report." And I would say, wait. That was dystopian. That was supposed to be a warning against the things we should not do. And yet, there was something about it being an influential movie that became attractive, almost as if the computer world was attracted to the dark scenario, attracted to the Matrix and the Terminator and all these things. It's very, very weird to me. Okay, so let me get back to my question. What should we test when we put our stuff out there? And to me, the very, very, very most important thing to test is not how fast our processes are. It's not how accurate our AI model is. It's not how secure our cryptographic protocol is, although those are all very important. But the very, very most important thing is, what's happening out in the human world? Are people better off as a result of what we've done or not? That clearly, obviously, has to be the thing that matters the most. So I want to just double check again. Are you all hearing me? Okay, great, because I'm getting echo, so I'm not sure if you're able to hear. Okay, so I have found it helpful to take on what I would call a radical humanist perspective. And I want to tell you what that is before I start applying it. The radical humanist perspective is very simply that people are the measure of reality. So, for instance, let's say you have a computer, I don't know, an iPad or whatever, an Android phone, whatever it is you have. If you were to take that computer to an alien planet somewhere and give it to them, if they did not know human culture, they might not recognize it as a computer. It might look like this thing that heats up and has patterns, so they might think it's a lava lamp. They might think it's a novelty. You can only recognize a computer when you have the culture to interpret the computer. You might be thinking to yourself, well, what about robots? Fair point, but even robots, they only make sense within a cultural context. A robot that is fixing a road makes sense if you know what a road is. Otherwise, it might just seem to be some random novelty machine breaking up cement or something. Now, you can argue about this. Honestly, there are multiple points of view that are all valid because there's no absolute truth. I'm just proposing that if you think of people being the measure of computation, if you think that a computer wouldn't even be there if a person didn't understand it, it helps you be a better computer scientist. It helps you be a better computer designer. And the reason that it helps is that technology is not like science or mathematics. You can develop science and mathematics in the abstract, just an increase in understanding. However, when you build technology, the only way to define progress is if there's a beneficiary. Otherwise, there's no sensible framework in which to define whether you succeeded or not. And sometimes it might be unclear. Is a technology better for a person or a dog? If it's like something involving dogs and people, you might argue about that. But the one thing you cannot argue with is that if there is no beneficiary, if there's no one the technology is for, the technology cannot make sense. It's not even a technology. Once again, you might not agree with me, and yet I can't imagine how you can be a designer or an engineer without designing for the benefit of someone. So, I have been around this business of trying to come up with computer architectures that are good for people for a really long time. I was in a small circle of friends with Richard Stallman back in the day when he came up with the open source idea. I've been around at the start of a lot of things. I often find myself with opinions that are a little different from people around me, but I think we all want the same thing. I mean, I really do. I think everybody of goodwill involved in computer technology wants a future where overall people feel at home, feel happy, where people are not suffering, where people have a sense of freedom that's authentic, where creativity is real, where the future is therefore open and not totally knowable. I think we all want that, right? I think those are qualities we agree on. There might be some other things we don't agree on, but I think what I've just said probably is a set of desires that everyone here shares. So one question you can ask is, what is the architecture that brings us that? That's a great question. But there's a different question, which I think is even more important, which is, let's look out there at the world and see whether what we've done so far is making it better or worse. That makes sense, right? That's what we should do if we are being responsible technologists. We should look at the experience of humanity, of people out there, and say, to the degree we've influenced things, are people better or worse off than they were before? before being, oh, I don't know, 40 or 50 years ago, since this whole adventure started. For some of you, you weren't around at the start of it, so it might seem strange to you to go back that far. I was around at the start of it, so for me, I see this whole thing progressing. I wish you all could have that perspective. I wish I could convey it to you somehow. Anyway, are things better or worse for real people out there? Well, let me start with the good news. There's a lot of ways that I think things are better. Let me just list a few of my favorite ones. One thing is that if somebody wants to acquire a skill, they have many more ways to do it, and it's much less expensive, much more open, and much more possible. If you want to learn to make your own pasta, there's probably YouTube videos. If you want to understand science, there are wonderful things online for free, Khan Academy, and so on. That's fantastic. What else is good? Well, there's a lot of creativity online. I love some of the forms that are only possible online. I think social gaming, oh my God, I don't even know where to start. There's wonderful things. I like a lot of online culture. You might think I'm foolish to like the dance culture of TikTok, but I do. I think it's fabulous. I like the code that you can find online. I like the fact that online code is filterable through a big AI model to make it easier for people who aren't good coders to code. A lot of this stuff is actually really good. Progress, it's cool. All right, I could go on, but those are some of the good things, and I think almost everybody would agree with me about those things being good. Maybe somebody doesn't, but I think, so that's good. I feel happy. Now, what's not good? Here, I really do think there are some things that are not good. The thing that bugs me the most is that when we were starting this whole project of having an internet, and this was deliberate. I mean, this thing started by people talking about it. Back in the 1980s, we had preliminary versions of what it would be like. There were things like Usenet, a very, very early sort of a social networking thing that some people here might be aware of. There were a whole bunch of different ideas for how to do something like the web. Tim Berners-Lee came up with the one that spread the most quickly and won. But the whole thing was like, we saw it coming, we were thinking about it. Now, the thing that's amazing to me and that we really need to think about here is that from this post-war period, let's say internet stuff started kind of in the 60s and gained momentum in the 70s, in the 80s, into the 90s. During that period, I think almost everyone agreed that the world became more democratic. I think almost everyone would agree that the world became more open. I think almost everyone would agree that the way some of the large powers in the world, not all of them necessarily, but let's say Russia, India, China, Brazil, Europe, some of you might disagree, but I think overall, these were not falling into some sort of increased darkness. They weren't perfect. None of them were. Speaking as an American, I know all about the ways the United States is not perfect, but overall, kind of a betterment, a direction of things getting better. When the first mobile phones came out, before they were smartphones, when all you could do was text between them, they did a remarkable thing in the developing world where farmers suddenly had a way to access information at a distance to optimize where they were selling and what they were growing and all of this. And that was part of what resulted in a remarkable reduction in absolute poverty in many places in the world. Absolutely amazing, something we had not predicted, and it was such a joy to see it. Okay, now something strange happened. With the new century, we see a lot of things reverse, and not in good ways. We start to see an increase in online cultures of opposition, paranoia, darkness, vanity, twitchiness, loss of attention span, all these things that have been studied a lot. And I think it's unreasonable to dispute that the social media design that took hold is part of the reason that happened. I started traveling around to witness elections in which this kind of darkness and this reversal seemed to have something to do with online culture. I was in Brazil for Bolsonaro and Turkey for Erdogan, and we see this parade of these sort of strange events that all have a similar quality around the world. Russia, China have gotten darker, more populist is the usual term. India, many parts of Europe, the US, we had Trump, which was really unprecedented. And the thing about all this stuff has a precedent in human affairs. It's not like there have never been dark times in countries before. Of course, they've gotten much darker than what we have seen at this point. I won't even talk about what happened here, but in the United States, we had a civil war not really that long ago, which was much more divided and much darker. But the thing is, in the late 20th century, things seem to be getting better. Then they seem to reverse. And the reversal, upon careful study, has something to do with the way the internet evolved. Okay, so this is very important. So we have to ask ourselves, what went wrong and what can we do about it? Now, I want to talk to you about some ideas for what I think went wrong at the most fundamental level and what we can do about it at the most fundamental level. I'm going to speak about very big ideas about architecture rather than detailed things. I don't want to complain about Mr. Zuckerberg or Mr. Musk or whatever. I could, but I don't think that's the point. I think we need to look at the bigger picture here. So, one big picture question is, are we measuring an architecture by the humans using it or by some abstract measure? That's an extremely important question, and I want to make that concrete by giving you an example. And some of you might not like this example, but I hope you'll consider it honestly. Let us think about the open source idea. Now, when open source started, which is over 40 years ago, I mean, a few years more than 40 years ago, the size of the source code that was around to be opened was small compared to today. The amount of data that might be relevant to how a program operated was really small compared to today. The number of important programs in the world was very small compared to today. So when you open sourced something, it had a different meaning than open sourcing things today. Now, just to put it very simply, open source only has an impact when whatever it is that's opened is intelligible to people. And by people, I don't just mean a very narrow set of elite people. This is extremely important. So, for instance, we're in the era of AI now, and many people say we need to open source AI. That's great. If we open source AI models without doing the work that remains to be done to make what is opened about them intelligible, we will have achieved nothing by any reasonable measure. Is that clear? So the thing is, the open source movement has gone as far as a sort of a technical open sourcing, but not as far as a cultural open sourcing. The difference between those two things is a very interesting gap. So the question is, do we make the world understandable for the people who inhabit it, or is it only understandable to a technical priesthood? That's extremely important. For instance, when someone is critical of the government and feels like governments might be difficult to work with and need to be routed around, some of the reason for that is that individuals in government from time to time might be assholes. Very typically that happens. But another reason is that the bureaucracy, the procedures of government become forbidding so that ordinary people don't have an effective way to do anything, to participate. They don't know the right people, they don't know the details, and they need high-priced lawyers to figure anything out, and they're effectively excluded even if by some technical measure they could do whatever they want. This is a huge problem in, well, all over the world. In the US, people who really want to engage with something with the government often get caught up in extreme levels of bureaucracy and complexity, and it effectively excludes people. Now, the question is, are we doing better than that? So if you go to a typical ordinary person who is, well, I'll just be blunt about it. A lot of typical ordinary people invested in some cryptocurrency or something like that and didn't do well. And you say, well, but you should have researched this, you should have done that. Why didn't you do this? Well, they're not technical. What are they supposed to do? They're facing an overwhelming level of complexity in practice. Now, whose responsibility is it to fix that? Well, it's got to be ours. Who else is going to do it? And so there's this issue that we tend to create an elite priesthood even when our intent is not to, unless we go that extra mile. It's a sort of a last mile problem. What do we do to connect with ordinary people so that they're actually, in fact, empowered? Now, this leads to something quite profound about this moment, and I want to try to express this fairly. And it's difficult because the bigger the picture you look at, the harder it is to really be certain or to cover all the details. But I want to try to express what seems to be, to me, to be an emerging darkness or a sort of a malaise in many people out there who aren't part of a technical elite. So I first noticed this a while ago when I was talking to high school students. And I said, I was judging students who had submitted science projects for a contest. They're very bright students, probably with excellent futures ahead. By now they're probably working at tech companies or something. And I said, what question do you want to ask me? What can I help you with? And the answer from all of them by consensus was, why did our parents have us? And I said, what do you mean, why did your parents have you? What are you talking about? And they said, well, what we're hearing from tech leaders, what we're hearing from AI scientists, what we're hearing from everybody is that the world is going to turn into an apocalyptic nightmare where very few will survive, and the whole thing sounds miserable. Why are we here? Why would anybody want kids? And I was just, I like teenagers, I like young people, and you hear all kinds of darkness and aggression and whatever, but this kind of sense of defeat, there's not even any defiance in it, in my experience, is something new. So I started to talk to them like, where did you get this? And they got it, speaking broadly, from us. They got it from the tech elite. They got it from people saying, there's no point in trusting anyone. You can't trust the government. You can't trust institutions. We're going to have only secure encrypted connections because that's all we can count on. Everything's going to turn to shit. Wow, that's pretty dark. It's rough. But then they heard it from AI scientists who say, well, AI is going to surpass us. Nobody will be needed for anything. If you're lucky, we'll set up some kind of a system where you get public assistance to survive, but you won't actually be needed. And then, well, who will be needed? Well, a certain tech elite, maybe. There'll be this very big difference in society between those on the inside of it and those on the outside of it. And they think to themselves, there's no future there. Now, I want to address AI for a second in particular, because it's the most extreme version of it, although I think this happens a lot in all kinds of things online. I work with AI a lot. I'm I'm not here representing Microsoft at all, but I am the prime scientist there, and I've been all over the inside of the new models, the ChatGPT and whatever, and Copilot. So I'm not speaking from a position as an outsider. And what I want to say about them is that you can look at these and you can interpret them in two different ways. You have the freedom to see them in two inversions, if you like. Are people here familiar with the artwork of M.C. Escher? Have you ever seen it? Yeah? Okay. I have very bright lights and I can't see you there, so I'm asking you to respond just so I have signs of life from you. All right, great. All right, so if you've seen M.C. Escher artwork, you might have seen some of his drawings that have an invertible quality, where you can see them either as a tiling, a field of birds, or the space in between the birds might be fish, and you can pay attention to that and see a bunch of fish with space between them. And both interpretations are equally valid. Do you know what I'm talking about? Ah, good. All right. So with AI, there's a similar inversion that's absolutely possible and is absolutely technically as correct as the other inversion. Usually when we talk about AI, we talk about AI as a thing or an entity of some kind. The AI did this, will the AI do that? How will the AI perform at this task? That's one inversion. There's another inversion where you don't see anything there that's a separate object, but all you see is a collaboration of people. You can say there's some people whose data was combined, very much like Wikipedia perhaps, but with more code. Or there's a combination of computer scientists whose work was combined. You can see this as a combination of people. And I know some people will say, well, but that only lasts for a while. At some point, won't the AI be so smart that you just have to treat it as its own thing? I don't think so. I think that inversion goes on forever. We have the choice. It's very much like that question of whether Martians think a computer is really a computer or if it's just some novelty. Like, it's up to how we interpret it. We have a lot of power to decide what we think computers are. If you tell people that AI is really a new thing and the AI is doing something and your contribution doesn't really matter anymore, then you get kids who are terribly alienated and wonder, what are we doing here? Now, that doesn't apply to many of the people in this room because all of you are with me in a technical elite. You might not like thinking of yourselves as being in an elite. You might say, we're the ones creating the cryptographic tools to protect people from the elite. But I think if you do that, you're not being entirely honest with yourselves, because the truth is that you have an ability to understand the tools. You have an ability to customize, to alter, to create, to use the tools that most people, the vast majority of people, simply do not have because your technical skills and background are superior. That doesn't make any of us smarter than anybody else, but we happen to be specialized in something that's a tremendous source of power right now. It's not comfortable to think that way. Honestly, you should be angry at what I'm saying because I'm saying that you have responsibility. I'm saying that you're an active player in the world on different dimensions than you might be used to thinking about. Or some of you might be saying, of course, why are you saying this? This is obvious. I don't know what you're thinking. I am not psychic. However, I do wish to encourage you to think in the way that I'm advocating. So the question is, let me put it even a little more bluntly. If we say that we are worried about governments as a primary obstacle and we want to hide from governments as the primary way to promote human freedom, there are many instances in the world where that's unquestionably true. You know, if you're living in Iran or Russia or many places right now, it's true. It's true. But not all of the world. And the thing is, if we're also creating a culture that has a way of bringing about increased authoritarianism as a trend, then protecting ourselves from authoritarianism is maybe not the first thing we should worry about. Maybe we should first worry about how to avoid promoting it. Now, you might say, what are we doing to promote it? Well, I think what I've just been describing, the cycle in which we make people feel left out, in which we make people feel that they're not important to the future, in which we make them feel as if we, the technical elite, are designing the future for them, they're not smart enough to. These are things that naturally create a kind of paranoia and a kind of darkness that actually promotes, it creates the fertile ground, it fertilizes authoritarian political tendencies. When we create systems in which, by definition, we don't suppose trust between people, we naturally reinforce distrust. This is difficult. Now, I don't think there are any absolutes here. I don't believe that a perfectly open trusting system is good, but I also don't believe that an absolute paranoid system with no trust at all is good. I think the truth is always somewhere in the middle, somewhere murky and messy. I think in messiness is where we find freedom, not in perfection. Now, let me give you another example. One of the things that happened around the turn of the century when the internet was transforming into what it is now was file sharing. File sharing was immensely popular. In fact, to oppose file sharing in music was to be on the side of the devil. And at that time, when it started, it was socially unacceptable not to be very supportive of it. I personally started to doubt it when I saw many classic, like older blues musicians who had been making a living no longer make a living. And I thought, wait, this cannot be our utopia. But that is not the most serious problem. There's a thing we have to admit. Now, the first thing I want to say is, I like Google. I've sold a company to Google. I am a Silicon Valley capitalist. I've sold startups to the big guys. I like big tech companies. I'm not opposed to us. This is my world. And yet, we have to admit something, which is that in the early part of the century, a lot of the anarchic file sharing people were actually funded by Google. And it's a weird thing. Like, if there's supposed to be some sort of anarchic, democratic, open, distributed thing, why is a big tech company behind it? Why is a company like Google supporting pirate parties and so on? Why? And the reason why, ultimately, is that there's more than one possible form of centralization. There's more than one form of concentration that can happen. If you're exclusively worried about the government or the record industry or whatever devil you want to undermine, that doesn't mean another devil won't come up. You have to be careful. So what can happen in a very open system where everybody's sharing and everybody's connected is that whoever becomes the most prominent hub of connections becomes the new boss, becomes the new central authority, whether you like it or not. Now, this is a property of math. This is not really something coming from human psychology or politics. It just happens that in an open network, certain things are true. So as soon as something is connected more than something else, if one node has more connections than the other node, it'll tend to get even more because it becomes more and more valuable. And this is called the network effect, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Now, sometimes the network effect isn't important, and sometimes it is. But when you have a very small number of giant companies that are the network effect owners, the hub owners, for the majority of human interpersonal connections, which is exactly the world we've entered into, something has gone very askew. So you have the situation where the motivations for those central hubs become, in my view, questionable. If you're a central hub, whatever it is, whether it's for finance, social connection, file sharing, whatever it is, eventually the control of robots with AI, I mean, all kinds of crazy things are about to happen. What you want is you want to make sure that you keep that position, or if you haven't gained it yet, you want to gain it. And so therefore, your number one priority is getting more and more connections to maximize your network effect. Once again, this is pure math. But what it translates to is something that's not just math, depending on the type of network it is. If it's a social network, it turns into a quest for attention. You want to channel attention. You want to get everybody's attention. And that goes very badly. And we're not talking about social networks as a primary theme here, but just very briefly, the algorithms that detect whether somebody is paying attention first see the data that comes from what we can call the negative emotions. You pay more attention to things that scare you, or to things that exercise your vanity or your insecurities, whether your paranoia, all kinds of things like that. And so those qualities of the human being, which in pre-internet times were more balanced, become a little accentuated. Not a lot, it's a slight effect, but it's cumulative. And you end up with this increase in a paranoid style. Once again, not new in human affairs. It's been with us since the beginning of history, but to have it rise all over the world suddenly at once, and always reliably a few years after social networking appears in a given country, yeah, we have a problem. We're making it worse instead of better. Now, the same thing happens with cryptocurrencies. The one with the most attention tends to get bigger and bigger, and so on. Now, how do we correct this? And this is a very interesting problem, because it's similar to the problem that runs inside the very algorithms that make it work. How do you get attention on a social network? How do you do it? Well, you use what we call these days AI algorithms. You use statistical correlations, and you attempt to find a solution so that the stream of information somebody's getting will get them to spend time on your hub instead of somebody else's. How do these algorithms work? Well, universally, they work in different ways, but they're adaptive. And what that means is that they have some form of gradient descent inside them. I'm sure you're all familiar with that is, but it's a type of algorithm that gradually optimizes for something, because there's no way to know in advance how to do it. So you incrementally play with your settings until you find an optimal setting. That's all it is. Now, the thing about this is that in order to have algorithms run the internet, you have to take extra precautions to make sure that the result you get from the settling, from gradient descent, is not overly simplistic. For instance, if you have a diffusion model generating images and you ask for a cat